today. It's a midday of the week, and I say welcome to the Gallery TV newspaper review this morning. My name is Titilayo Olamide, and I have with me this morning the Nigerian daily newspapers. I have Punch, Daily Sun, Nigerian Tribune, The Nation, and of course the Guardian newspaper, and lastly, that would be the Daily Independent newspaper this morning. And of course, I will go with the Punch newspaper first. And on the major news headline, it says, outrage as uniform wearing gunmen invade NDA. Errant officers to face trial. Terrorists in army uniform subdue military officers, kill 2, adopt 1. Our security architecture was compromised, says Nigerian Defense Academy. It's terrible, a big embarrassment to the nation, ACF, Sokapu, and other lament. And the stories can be found on page 2 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move to above the major news headline. It says PDP speaks as 2 chairmen emerge. Wike secondos divide party officers. And that story can be found on page 10 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. PIA government can sell NNPC shares to individuals, says Kyari. And that's on page 19. Concession to leave $1 billion loan for FAAN aviation workers. Concession to leave $1 billion loan for FAAN, and that's coming from the aviation workers, and that story can be found on page 10 also inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And then I move Saudi Arabia Recruitment Center, another oath today. Consultants, other senior doctors storm Saudi Arabia Recruitment Center, another oath today. And then I have soldiers dies in army detention center, widow demands justice. 28 states with storage facility gets vaccine doses. 28 states with storage facilities get vaccine doses. And the commuters stranded as Lagos driver protests alleged tax force extortion. Commuters stranded as Lagos State drivers protest alleged tax force extortion. And that can be found on page 4 and 5 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And then lastly, on the Punch newspaper front page stories on 2022 budget at the first transport works get highest capital allocation. At the first transport works get highest capital allocation, and that can be found on page 26 inside the Punch newspaper this morning. And then with that, I move to Daily Sun. On Daily Sun newspaper front page stories this morning, and on the major news headline, I have confusion in PDP as 2 AG chairmen emerge. Akinwunmi suspends NWC indefinitely. Nazif Summers neck meeting Friday. And the stories can be found on page 6 inside the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. Moving above the major news headline, and that's on page 2. Nigerians to have new revenue formula 28 years after. And then I move above that on page 8. Says government kills 6 in Rivers communities. Military neutralizes kidnappers, recovers weapons in Plateau State. And the stories can be found on page 6 inside the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And still on the front page stories of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning, moving below the major news headline. Anambra gubernatorial election, police plan track down on ESN, IPOB. Police plan track down on ESN and IPOB. The story can be found on page 15 inside the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And then I turn to page 3. Governors Lawan Kalu greets Sultan at 65. Governor Nawan Kalu greets Sultan at 65. And this story can be found on page 3 inside the Daily Sun newspaper this morning. And so below is Zulum. Over 100,000 has been killed so far in the northeast, and that is coming from Zulum. And then still, I move to page 8. Igboho's associates still in detention after bail. Igboho's associates still in detention after bail. You can turn into page 8 of the Daily Sun newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then I move to page 7. And on page 7, I have fury over terror attack at NDA. Fury over terror attack at the NDA. You can turn it to page 7 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. And then moving forward, that's on page 4. Said military neutralizes 6 kidnappers, recovers weapon in Plateau State. Ministry neutralizes 6 kidnappers, recovers weapon in Plateau State. You can turn into page 4 this morning of the Daily Sun newspaper to read more on that story. And then lastly, on the front page stories of the Daily Sun newspaper, and that's on page 6. Kebbi Assembly impeaches Speaker, Deputy. Kebbi Assembly impeaches Speaker and the Deputy. You can turn it to page 6 this morning of the Daily Sun to read more on that story. And then I move to Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. On the front page stories of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper and the major news headline, I have PDP crisis, 2 deputy national chairman claims secondos post. 2 deputy national chairman claims secondos post. And then this morning I have 2 major news headlines on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. The other says shock as bandits kill 2 military officers, adopt one inside NDA. Founding fathers didn't establish NDA for bandits to take over, and that is coming from the ACF. We are after them, the DHQ. Nigerians have lost hope in Buhari APC. That is coming from the PDP, that is the opposition party in Nigeria. And then lastly, attack indicates collapse in Nigeria's intelligence network. The attack indicates collapse in Nigeria's intelligence network. And that is coming from the Northern Leaders. You can find out more on the stories on page 2 inside the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then I move above the major news headline this morning. Said RMAFC to submit new formula to Buhari in December. RMAFC to submit new formula to President Muhammadu Buhari in December. You can turn into the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning to read more on that story. Still on the front page news stories of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning, and that's on page 7. NNPC GMD defends 30% allocations to frontline Basin, says percentage does not reflect reality. NNPC GMD defends 30% allocation to frontier Basin, says percentage does not reflect reality. You can turn into page 7 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving to page 6, the court strikes out DSS suit seeking further detention of 4 Igboho's aides. You can turn into page 6 this morning to read more on that story. And then moving below the major news headline, and that's on insurgency in Nigeria. 10% of Borno population missing, says 100,000 killed in Northeast in 12 years. That is coming from Zulum. You can turn into page 3 this morning to read more on that story. Oyetola wants court case against Aregbesol's associates discontinued. That's coming from the governor of Osun State. Governor Oyetola wants court case against Aregbesol's associates discontinued. You can turn into the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then below it is the Glow TV will give best content for Assures subscribers. Glow TV will give best content for Assures subscribers. You can turn into the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving below is Ex-NCC chairman Durojaye dies at 88. Ex-NCC chairman Durojaye dies at 88. And then lastly, on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning, Joyce crisis, Oyo, Akwa Ibom evacuates over 155 students from UniJOS. Joyce crisis, Oyo, Akwa Ibom evacuates over 155 students from UniJOS. And that's all on the Nigerian Tribune newspaper this morning. And then I move to the Nation newspaper. On the front page stories of the Nation newspaper this morning, on the major news headline, it says military launches halt for officers and doctors at NDA. Military launches halt for officers and doctors in NDA. You can turn into the Nation newspaper this morning to read more on that story. Moving above the major news stories, says Afenifere Chief Durojaye dies at 88. Afenifere Chief Durojaye dies at 88. You can turn into the Nation newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving to page 27, Osho drops charges against APC secretary as commissioners. Osho drops charges against APC secretary as commissioners. You can turn into the Nation newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then on insurgency in Nigeria, 10% of Borno residents missing Zulum, and the federal government plans 13.98 trillion naira budget for next year. Moving below the major news headline, it says second dose suspension throws PDP deeper into confusion. Second dose suspension throws the National Opposition Party PDP deeper into confusion, and that can be found on page 22 inside the Nation newspaper this morning. And it's Deputy Chairman battle for control. Deputy Chairman battles for control, and WC splits into two. You can read more on that story on page 22 of the Nation newspaper this morning. And then lastly, on the Nation newspaper this morning, API 1 year takes off plan strange to law, says Kyari. APIA 1 year takes off plan strange to law, says Kyari. And that's all we can take this morning on the Nation newspaper. And then with that, I move to the Guardian newspaper. On the front news stories, on the front page stories of the Guardian newspaper this morning, the major news headline says NDA attack slap on military, Yoruba, Northern elders film. NDA attack slap on the military, Yoruba, Northern elders film. Says bandits contact NDA demands 200 million ransom for adopted major, and that is coming from the source. Nigeria security to reverse gear, says Arewa leaders. Group demands immediate overhaul of security architecture. Nigerians have lost hope in President Muhammadu Buhari APC-led administration, says PDP. And all these stories can be found on the front page of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then moving above the major news headline, says EFCC orders banks to probe income sources of customers. APC orders banks to probe income sources of customers. You can read that inside the Guardian newspaper this morning. And the next to read is 6 Terginal pupils died in captivity. 6 Terginal pupils died in captivity. You can turn into the Guardian newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then still on the front page stories of the Guardian newspaper this morning, Kebbi Assembly Speaker Deputy impeached. Kebbi Assembly Speaker and the Deputy impeached. You can turn into page 6 to read more on that story. And then court strikes out DSS suit seeking further detention of 4 Igbo's aide. Court strikes out DSS suit seeking further detention of 4 of Igbo's aides. You can turn into the Guardian newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving below the major news headline, PDP in a mess as 2 acting chairmen surface. PDP in a mess as 2 acting chairmen surface. Akinwumi Nazif claimed chairmanship position. Naviv 5 emergency net meeting for Friday, and Akinwumi postponed NWC meeting indefinitely. You can read the story on the front page of the Guardian newspaper this morning. And then we move to the last newspaper story for today, and of course that is the Daily Independent newspaper. And on the front page stories of the Daily Independent newspaper, the headline says NDA attack shows all is wrong with our security. NDA attack shows all is wrong with our security, and that is coming from ACF. Northern Elders says it's intelligence failure, wants NSA sacked. NDA vows to track bandits who killed 2 soldiers, abducted 1. You can turn into the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving above the major news headline, we're in perplexing situation as a nation. We are in a perplexing situation as a nation, and that is coming from Tunde Bakare. Says nothing wrong if a Northerner succeeds Buhari in 2023. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And they surrendered 2,800 insurgents have created humanitarian crisis. Zulum says not all surrendered insurgents are criminals. You can turn into the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story also. And then moving below the major news headline, and we have the PDP crisis festers as 2 deputy chairmen fight over second seat. okays 292.6 billion naira for varsities, polytechnics, education colleges. You can turn it to page 26 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And then moving to page 6, panic as government invade Rivers communities, kill 6 persons. You can turn it to page 6 this morning to read more on that story. And then on page 5 of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning, 34 states under threat of flash flooding. Igbo, and then moving to page 5, Igbo hosts 8, DSS heads to appeal court. DSS heads to appeal court, and that's on the case of Igbo hosts 8 being taken to court today. And then on page 5, it says TCN restores national power grid after partial system disturbance. TCN restores national power grid after partial system disturbance. You can turn it to page 5 this morning to read more on that story. And then still on the front page stories of the Daily Independent newspaper, government should stop borrowing to fix economy, and that is coming from Samson Lamido, and that's on page 2. Government should stop borrowing to fix the economy. And then lastly on page 9, and that is coming from Idahosa, Jonathan will be heavily defeated if he contests in 2023. Jonathan will be heavily defeated if he contests in 2023, and that is coming from Idahosa. You can get a copy of the Daily Independent newspaper this morning to read more on that story. And that's all we can take this morning on the Gallery TV newspaper review. Don't forget to get the copies of all these newspapers to read more on their stories. And of course, join us by 12 p.m. and of course 4 p.m. for our daily top news stories for today. I am Titilayo Olamide. Thanks for watching, and you have a lovely day.